Good morning, everyone. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to you all joining us on our event today, the second in a series of events organised by the Branded Content Research Hub. Today's event is on branding, but before we start, I would just like to acknowledge the devastating impact of the invasion of Ukraine. As a public university, we have a duty to express and to deliver on our solidarity with all those in or escaping Ukraine. In particular, we recognise the desperate plight of students from India, Morocco, and so many other countries in Ukraine at the moment and trying to leave. And of course, also the students at this university and others from Ukraine, Russia, and other countries who are so deeply affected by what's going on. We should also note that amongst the war crimes taking place has been an attack on universities and on museums and cultural institutions, with a museum of Ukrainian folk art destroyed earlier this week. So with that, let me now turn to what today's event is all about, the work of education, which we hope can continue without war across the world. I'd like to welcome you to this second event in a series of talks hosted by the Branded Content Research Hub. Our origins are in a project funded by the UK Research Council, which ran in 2016, and we've rebuilt the hub as I've moved from the University of East London to the University of the Arts London, my new home. And this is really part of a resurgent programme of events, talks and networking for our research hub, which invites everyone, academics, industry, civil society, interested and concerned about branded content to join us. So we've relaunched, amongst other things, the Branded Content Research Network. And for any of you listening to this event today who'd like to join that and be kept informed about future events, please do email me and I'll sign you up for that network. If I can have the next slide, please, Tommaso. So as well as our event today, we have a series of events taking place. So please note next week, a panel discussion with people from industry, with our own academic from University of Arts London, Sebel Yesaloglu, an expert in influencer marketing, lawyers and others who are going to be discussing the frontiers, the leading edge of practices in influencer marketing, and also some of the real issues of governance and regulation around those. Then on the 27th of April, one of our industry partners for the network, Andrew Cantor, Global CEO of the Branded Content Marketing Association, is going to be speaking. And the final event in this run is by Maria Rodriguez Rabadan Benito, who will be discussing her doctoral thesis and postdoctoral work on branded entertainment and creative practices. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to those. But now let me introduce today's event and our speaker. Next slide, please, Tommaso. Dr. Susie Khamis is senior lecturer in and now associate professor in public communication. Her doctoral thesis, Bushels and the Cultural Logic of Branding, won the Sydney Harbour Foreshore Heritage Prize in 2007. And in 2011, she was the founding editor of Local, the Australasian Pacific Journal of Regional Food Studies. Her research areas are wide, covering branding, the representation of cultural diversity and consumer cultures. And she's published widely in these areas. She wrote Self-Branding, Micro-Celebrity and the Rise of Social Media Influencers in 2017, a key text for current research on influencers. She co-edited Decoding Coca-Cola, a biography of a global brand published by Routledge in 2021. And she wrote the book on which her talk today is based, for a series I'm very proud to edit, the Routledge Critical Advertising Studies series. And her book was published in 2020. Branding Diversity, New Advertising and Cultural Strategies is really the first key book to consider and analyze cultural branding since the rise of programmatic advertising, and as such makes a significant contribution to the field. Susie is a pioneer. in examining brand activism and its expansion beyond CSR, corporate social responsibility, and in examining brands' promotion and performance in relation to key issues such as climate emergency and sustainability. She's currently completing her second sole author book for Routledge, Branding and Crises, Resistance and Adaptability in an Interconnected World. She's also, and this is something I hope we'll come on to at the end of this session in discussion, she's also currently involved in a research and action project designed to respond to a pressing need across the sector, to increase and strengthen diversity commitments across advertising agencies. And a key priority of that work is to investigate how well these practices support Indigenous Australian students, graduates and employers. I should say, if I didn't, she teaches at the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. So I'm sure that will be one of many topics you'd like to ask Susie about. But first, it is my great pleasure to welcome Susie Khamis to speak to you today.
Good morning, London. It's evening in Sydney, but I do say good morning. Thank you, Jonathan. I hope that the sound is okay and you can hear me okay. It's an absolute delight to be addressing everyone this morning. I'm seeing some messages in the chat box, so I hope I can be heard. It's all good. Thank you. So we might start the slide deck if that's okay. Thank you so much. So yeah, I work at the University of Technology, Sydney. I am the head of discipline for strategic communication, which really looks at all things public relations, marketing, media and advertising. And for the last 20 years, I have researched almost exclusively on contemporary brand phenomena. And throughout, I have always focused on brands that I feel are doing, saying interesting things, are engaging with culture and telling stories that are either innovative or provocative or shed some light on society, on culture, on politics. And that was very much my intention for the book, Branding Diversity, where I really zoned in on just 4 brands as case studies, but really it was the culmination of several decades of exploring what I think are, interesting brands, and not always new, trendy, fresh brands, sometimes old, iconic heritage brands that I thought were saying interesting things and speaking about contemporary times in ways that were instructive and perhaps probably underestimated as cultural artifacts and as political stories. So that is the focus of the book and today's talk. So I will talk, I think, broadly about the space that I inhabit in my analysis, in my research, before focusing on 4 brands in particular that I thought did some really interesting messaging over the last few years. My email address is there. I'm always eager to engage with students that want to explore these issues in more depth. Sometimes you might be working on an assessment and you'd like another opinion, or if you're a high degree research student, I'm always interested in talking to potential PhDs or honours students. So if this is your thing, if this is an area that you would like to engage in more depth and detail, please send me an email. I would be delighted to hear from you. Thanks, Tom. So really what all my research looks at is what I like to call the cultural logic of branding. And that was the subtitle of my PhD thesis a long time ago. And I was really interested, and still am interested, in how brands do more than move product. And I think that is the kind of, the layperson's understanding of what brands do. They advertise, they cast, commodities in the best possible light for commercial mileage, for commercial value. And I took a different view. For me, brands do more than that. For me, brands tell stories through vignettes, through symbolism, through connotations. And what I have found over the last, 20 years is that this propensity is not product category specific. which is why a brand of sneaker can say something about politics, which is why, the car that you drive can say something about your sense of, environmentalism, which is why a brand of chocolate can say something about your feelings about labour conditions, about fair pay for workers in developing economies. What I have found over the last few decades is that this tendency for brands to connect to stories that are bigger and more important than the product itself was on the rise, was intensifying and accelerating. And what I was finding was increasingly brands weren't just addressing us as consumers in a marketplace of choice, but were increasingly addressing us through narratives and stories that historically or traditionally spoke to our civic identities. And what I mean by that is, when I was growing up, there was a kind of tacit split or demarcation between our civic selves and our private selves. So in the public sphere, we would deliberate issues of public importance as citizens, the economy and politics and organisation of social life. And in the private sphere, behind closed doors, was where we expressed our personal private lives, our fashion choices, our sexual identities, our food choices. And there was, a kind of a separation of the two. Increasingly, that separation is becoming blurred, if not disappearing. And what we're finding increasingly is that consumers are more and more factoring political public issues and considerations into their personal private domains and decision-making spaces. And that includes their political identities and their political choices and demands. And so often our political identities are manifesting in the world as lifestyle choices. And that comes across in what we choose to buy, eat, drive, or wear. And this is, manifesting all over the place. And it is very obvious now, but it is a shift that has been in train for several decades. So it seems like it's happening quite intensely over the last few years, but we've seen this coming for several decades. Next slide, please. I haven't got the space or the time now to unpack this particular aspect of the story. So I'll give you the shortened, abridged version. Once upon a time, it was relatively easy to demarcate the public sphere, the space of politics and important things, from the private sphere, individual private lifestyle spaces and formations. That is increasingly hard to do for several reasons, but I think these are some of the most important and paramount and salient. First of all, the traditional sites of the public sphere, the traditional sites for the organisation of civic life have weakened and waned for several interrelated huge reasons, including economic globalisation, the splintering, the crumbling of social institutions, which were once steadfast and proud and respected, and the decline of group-based centres of solidarity and loyalty, whether that is community organisations or certain political formations like political parties or trade unions, even though I know that there is a very important and worthwhile strike right now in the UK. But many of these formations have weakened in membership, in visibility, in salience, and in some important respects, sometimes in esteem and respect. And what we're finding is, whereas these were historically and traditionally the spaces and the sites where we would channel and articulate our political and civic identities and demands and grievances, increasingly we are finding alternative ways and spaces to channel our grievances, make our political demands, coordinate action, and escalate our concerns to the powers that be. Next slide, please. Which is all another way of saying that the way that we as individuals, and a society do politics has changed. Increasingly, it's not something that we necessarily, just kind of relegate to the voting booth or to traditional press or to town hall meetings. Increasingly, we are factoring our political choices, our political identities in our personal lifestyle decisions and activities, and that necessarily includes consumption. So consumers are weaving political choices through our personal lifestyle decisions. And this is really where we arrive at the topic for today's talk, because this affects necessarily how we shop, what we buy. And brands, by virtue of, survival and their instinct for surviving anything, must negotiate this or risk losing relevance and visibility and commercial cut through. And I'm not the first or only person to notice and document this trend. There is some wonderful work by Sarah Benet-Weiser looking at what she calls commodity activism, which she sees as the merging of political and social goals with what's often deemed consumer behaviour. And this necessarily draws activism and political activity through capitalist frameworks, because that's really what consumer culture is made up of. And she sees the rise of commodity activism, which is relying on this kind of artifact and perhaps figment of the neoliberal imagination, the consumer citizen, hyphenated. And what we see there, that hyphen is really important because it acknowledges that whilst it was once possible or ideal to separate the consumer from the citizen, it's no longer possible. That doesn't make sense. And, obviously this invites some skepticism, perhaps even some pushback when we reduce political activity to something, she says, as easy as a swipe of your credit card. But effectively, often when consumers vote for certain things, they are making a political statement, whether that is for sustainability and consumption or organic production methods or social inclusion. But effectively, what we see is political action becoming unnecessarily personal and individual exercise. And conceptually, this is really important because traditionally and historically, we've seen politics as something that relies on and is motivated by group formations, social formations. And really what today's talk, looks at is how increasingly our political activities and demands are really being scaled down to these very personal, individual decisions and activities for better and for worse. Next slide. So really, to paraphrase a very old slogan from the second wave feminist movement, the personal is political. That's always been the case, but really, it's really obvious in today's talk. And what we've seen is increasingly spaces and areas of social life which were once deemed or perhaps hoped to be beyond or above commodification, consumer culture, are no longer above. They've been folded into the consumerist processes and commercial logic from religions and projects of self-identity formation, creativity, politics. There is hardly a single space left in our social lives that has not been commodified, that has not been branded. And what this does is make it really hard for us to continue to separate the consumer from the citizen, or the public sphere from the private sphere, the personal from the political. And effectively what this means is citizen consumers almost always make lifestyle choices that articulate or put out into the world a particular conviction, a point of view, a sense of purpose, and often make some commitment to a greater goal or value. So saying something more about how we want the world to be, that is more than I just like this brand of sneaker or I just like this brand of chocolate. Next slide, please. So really that brings us to what some might consider an uncomfortable reality, which is that capitalist systems and processes which were once considered to be outside of or in conflict with the public good, the social good, or were unable to speak to civic concerns, are actually now being drawn into that kind of dialogue and those kinds of conversations. What we're seeing is that capitalist organisations, like big brands, are venturing into politicised spaces. And effectively what they're doing, I think, is actually imbuing consumer culture, the world of advertising and spin and PR, with some civic capital through stories and symbolism and decisions that are instructive in what I think is a very positive and, you know, very future-focused portrayal of multicultural life. And I'll give you here a very simple example. And what you see right now are 3 advertisements for Campbell's Soup, the iconic American soup brand. And the first 2 are, of course, you know, from the 1950s. And they picture, right, the sort of person typically imagined to be concerned with, you know, the provision of food for the family, whether that is the children or in that second image there, she's, you know, cooking for her father, and he's impressed that the Campbell's soup is so much like, you know, the homemade traditional soup. And she's beautifully coiffed and made up and literally wearing an apron in the kitchen. And for a long time, that is how convenience packaged foods were sold to us, as something that was, you know, for the convenience, was still healthy and nutritious and good for the family, and almost invariably came from the mother, right? Because this was, you know, the cradle of love and nurturing and concern for the family unit. Fast forward to a television ad for Campbell's Soup from 2 years ago, which screened on American television to much, much controversy. And it is also set in a domestic space, in a home, with a family. And that family is also invested in the child's health and nutrition. And so that son is being fed Campbell's Soup by his 2 dads. This is a huge departure from the narrative we saw a few decades ago, not even 50, 60 years ago, but in my lifetime growing up. All right, Campbell's Soup and those in that family were almost invariably pictured in domestic settings, which recreated a particular version of the typical nuclear family, which may or may not have looked like the actual families that I knew and interacted with. And so what we are seeing is Campbell's, an iconic brand in American culture, making a bold, emphatic statement about what the modern family looks like. And I have to tell you that the pushback on social media was ferocious and swift. And if you're interested, check out, you know, Google how Campbell's responded to some of the direct messaging that it received. It was a masterclass in PR. Next slide, please. It doesn't always work out well, okay? And for decades now, occasionally brands will do something crazy and decide to engage with a topical hot issue by way of playing into a particularly compelling or salient issue of the day. And that still happens. And they don't always get it right, which makes it easy for us sometimes to read any kind of exchange between capitalist organisations and citizen consumers in very cynical ways and just see them as being very opportunistic and often a bit tone deaf. And, you know, it's easy for us to say, oh, well, you know, brands at the end of the day have got no business playing politics, and they'll only ever innovate to the extent that, you know, they seem fashionable or on trend, but they would never boldly do or say something that will actually instigate or invite actual social change. And of course, even over the last few years, I too cringe when I see brands, you know, trying to engage with an important issue and getting it very wrong. These images are from a TV commercial which lasted about 5 minutes because Pepsi very quickly responded to the avalanche of response that it got on social media. And it starred Kendall Jenner, and I'm glad her name is on the screen there because I always forget which of the Kardashians it is. And it was a television commercial that tried to recreate the narrative and the imagery of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it pictured Kendall literally walking off a modeling shoot and seeing a crowd walk by and you know, sort of guided by curiosity, she joins the protest march, realizes it's a Black Lives Matter march, and by way of, you know, diffusing the tension and making peace, she hands a Pepsi can to one of the police officers. It didn't go down very well because it didn't read the room, and it was very tone deaf, and it showed nothing in the way of earnest, meaningful, authentic engagement with the issues that dominated Black Lives Matter. So brands don't always get it right. Okay, so I'm the first to acknowledge that. But what I do want to look at are still some brands that I think do go on into these political spaces in ways that are bold, adventurous, and are genuinely risky. Okay, next slide, please. And I think in many ways, the fact that Pepsi commercial really didn't last very long, Pepsi pulled it as fast as I think was logistically and technologically possible, is because when brands do engage with what are often contentious or polarizing or controversial issues, when they don't engage in a way that's meaningful, authentic, or smart, they are very quickly called out by consumers, because we have social media and consumers have ways to let brands know when they have, missed the mark. And so really right now, in the 21st century, this is a period of hyper connectivity, smartphones, and radical visibility. So if there's anything in a brand's messaging that isn't consistent, they are called out very quickly and very loudly. So really the onus is on brands to make sure that they very carefully sync their public facing messaging and whatever feel good or woke messaging they've come up with for their advertising with their internal operations, with their business as usual around the clock. They must synchronize every aspect of their inner workings with their cultural presence, with what they put out into the world. Because if there are transgressions or hypocrisy or any kind of duplicity, they'll be called out. And so really what we're seeing increasingly is brands trying to actually design within the value chain as much as possible a commitment to diversity that is holistic or 360. Because what consumers are looking for more than ever are brands that provide some kind of compelling narrative, a message with a purpose, but also a brand that they can trust. And that's really important. Next slide, please. So really what we're seeing are brands taking on board this pursuit of trust and kind of turning it into a question of ethics that they will commit to, ethical conduct. And really because, when they don't see this through fully and with sincerity, they're called out. What we're seeing are brands adopting what are called glass box conditions. And what that means is pretty much assuming that every aspect of the brand's organization and operation and decision-making processes are legit and are true to whatever public promises they have made to the greater good. So for example, if they have, a brand message which hinges on some commitment to gender equality, and the key decision makers in that organization are all men, they will be called out on that. Or if they make very public promises and commitments to cultural diversity and demographic diversity, and their board is anything but culturally diverse, they will be called out on that. And so what we're seeing are brands assuming glass box conditions. Let's just imagine the brand is a glass box and everyone can see everything inside and out. So really expressing empathy to diversity, inclusion, sustainability, all these things must be anchored in something real and authentic. And what these commitments also do is connect the brand to cultural flashpoints, the conversations which are dominating social media or the evening news or your social media feeds. And what this does is link the brands to something that's real, that's happening in the world today, but also something that the consumer can engage with emotionally. And what we're seeing is a real expansion of the kind of ethical commitments that brands are making. So, whereas, for much of the 90s and early 2000s, brands that were doing good tended to be associated with things like, fair trade practices or organic ingredients. We're really seeing an expansion of how we view and understand what ethical commitments can look like. Next slide, please. And I think a good example here is Nike, which I think has done some really interesting things over the last few years. So ostensibly on paper, Nike's business is sportswear, specifically, sports shoes. I suspect that takes the lion's share of its profit. But what I think is fascinating is how over the last few years, Nike's branding has spoken about almost everything except shoes, except sport. I am intrigued by their advertisements, which are almost invariably very affirmative, without being aspirational in a kind of impossible, exclusive way. But they're very much about drawing in every person into a lifestyle of just trying, right? The just do it kind of philosophy. And I think one of their most recent campaigns really captured just how far brands have moved from speaking almost exclusively about the product, about, how wonderful this shoe is, to something so far away from that product, in a way that is bold and controversial, and I think really instructive. And the commercial that I'm thinking of is the Dream Crazy TV commercial. I won't show you this evening or this morning in your world. Very easy to find it online. And in many ways, it's a typical Nike ad, what we've come to expect, which is a very, just do it ad, which is a roll call, if you like, of sports athletes who have really triumphed and achieved wonderful things despite coming across discrimination and stigma and doubters and deniers. And we see people, like the Williams sisters, the girls from Compton who go on to become the greatest athletes in the world. We see a hijabi boxer, so a female boxer who wears hijabi, contesting stereotypical images of Muslim women. We see refugees that came from Havalas to become, millionaire soccer stars. And in many ways, it's a very typical Michael Jordan and Spike Lee. I'll come back to Michael Jordan and Spike Lee. All right. In many ways, it's a typical Nike ad until you get to the final image and the symbolism of that final image. And the final image is this. Next slide. It is, of course, the face and just the face of Colin Kaepernick. So when Kaepernick appeared in this Nike ad, it was at the tail end of what was probably one of the most traumatic and polarizing episodes in his life. So for those of you that don't know, Kaepernick was a quarterback, an American quarterback with the San Francisco 49ers, and he famously, from 2016, took a knee. So, before a football match, when the national anthem was being played, Kaepernick would take a knee in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement to protest what was at least decades of police brutality against young Black American men. And for that, Kaepernick became an extremely controversial figure. So his appearance in this Nike ad is highly symbolic, emotive, and polarizing. And the campaign, philosophy and slogan was this: believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. So from any other sports star, this might have seemed glib or whatever, but coming from Kaepernick or attached to Kaepernick, it meant everything, because he literally lost his football career on the basis of his action from taking a knee. Next slide, please. We now know that Kaepernick's action inspired sports stars around the world who, like Kaepernick, wanted to show their solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I have to stress, as many of you would know, the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, precedes Kaepernick and the taking of the knee. We know that, okay? But effectively, what Kaepernick did was take the Black Lives Matter, sentiment and idea, take it away from the chat rooms and the news feeds and those safe political spaces, and put it on the football field and remind people who only wanted to watch the football about something that was really, a horrendous, reality for a lot of Americans. So he took a knee. And effectively what he was doing was spotlighting the heartbreaking gap between the sentiments expressed in the national anthem and the lived experience of young Black American men. And we now know that action of taking the knee spread around the world. And we saw it across the UK, across Europe, in Australia, we saw it. Next slide, please. And gosh, was it controversial. And this came to a head really in September 2017, when then President Donald Trump literally called on NFL bosses to fire any players that refused to stand during the anthem. And it was obviously a pointed rebuke, not just to Kaepernick, but to every athlete, which by then, and there were many of them, that were also followed suit and were taken a knee. And really what this episode spoke to was a very divided country. It put a spotlight on, intense and heartbreaking police brutality and the social positioning of African Americans. But it also reminded us of the extent to which the Trump era coincided with the unapologetic politicization of all cultural spaces, including sport. So yes, Kaepernick made, the cover of Time magazine. He also upset a lot of TV viewers. And we know this because the ratings went down. Next slide, please. And this marked a real sort of, a cultural and political flashpoint. At the end of that particular season, Kaepernick was a free agent. He could sign up with any football team. Not a single one wanted to pick him up. He was judged, presumably, a commercial liability. He wasn't out of form. He was still a phenomenal footballer. But, he was a liability. And commercially, right, that's a problem. That's a problem. He antagonized many Americans. Next slide, please. So not a single football team picked him up, but Nike picked him up as a brand ambassador. Okay. So when he delivers that line, believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything, from Kaepernick at that time, it really meant a lot, because he had lost his career, his livelihood, without football. So yes, he took a knee. He stood up to racism, bigotry, and prejudice. So when Nike hires him as their brand ambassador, they too are making that same stand. Okay, they showed his face, not him, being a phenomenal football star wearing the shoes. They showed his face. Okay, it paid off for Nike. Within 3 weeks, they had exceeded their market cap by $6 billion. Okay. Obviously, it resonated with a lot of consumers. It also generated a lot of free press for Nike. All right, there was a lot of, a lot of media coverage. Next slide, please. And of course, because it was such a controversial move, there was also ferocious and very quick online backlash. Okay, and many people took to social media, literally burning their Nike shoes, or cutting up their Nike. What are they called? Socks. Okay. And this is something that we see increasingly, which is that when brands make a bold, emphatic stand, or take a position, really they're courting controversy, and they're basically saying to the world, this is where we stand, and you might like it or you might hate it. And those that hate it are very quick to articulate that, on social media. And what we're seeing increasingly is that really consumers are becoming co-collaborators in these conversations playing out on social media. So for every bold or controversial statement that a brand makes, it's effectively saying, right, this is where we stand. And let's see how this plays out. Next slide, please. So what this shows us, I think, or what this is some clue about, is that when brands venture into these politicized spaces, they do so on a spectrum of intensity and commitment. Okay, so some brands take baby steps and make kind of soft, quiet commitments to diversity, and others are a bit more holistic and bolder. And so what I think is really interesting is seeing how brands can integrate what are potentially polarizing views in ways that are unexpected, adventurous, or provocative. I focused on just 4 brands for my book, and they're not necessarily brands that I think have done this the best or whatever. But for me, they were interesting because they were unexpected. And the brands that I looked at were Budweiser beer. I've got zero interest in beer, but Budweiser did something really interesting that I wanted to consider in a bit more depth. Gillette razors, right? I'm not the target demographic, but they came up with an ad which dominated news feeds for days, which is a long time, now. And so I was curious to see why they went there and what it means for an iconic heritage brand to say something so controversial. So the first brand I wanted us to look at was Budweiser. So for those of you that don't know, Budweiser has for decades sold itself as America's favorite beer, as America's beer. And in the 2017 Super Bowl, Budweiser ran an ad that really took a lot of people by surprise. I should say that the 2017 Super Bowl was the first Super Bowl after the Trump's inauguration, in fact, just a few weeks afterwards. And many of you would know this already, but the Super Bowl broadcast commands the highest advertising rates in the world. And, brands craft their advertisements knowing that this is premium advertising real estate. In 2017, the halftime entertainment was Lady Gaga. Many had expected Gaga to use the opportunity to make some kind of, anti-Trump statement. She did not. She sang and danced exactly as she was, asked to do. Instead, what we got from the advertisements was what seemed like, one ad after another, making what were often very pointed references to the Trump administration, including Budweiser. And if we can just watch this ad, please.
You don't look like you're from around here.
Warum bist du aus Deutschland?
I want to brew a beer.
Welcome to America.
You're not wanted here. Get out of here. You're on the feet. Go back home.
Welcome to St. Louis, son.
Beer for my friend, please.
Thank you. But next time, this is the beer we drink.
Eberhard Denheiser.
Dolphus Bush.
Okay, so effectively what the brand does is retell the origin story of Budweiser beer. So, and Anheuser-Busch, how they got together. It reimagines that origin story as a story of a refugee who comes to America and faces pushback and discrimination and racism and perseveres with a dream and goes on to create an iconic beer brand. I know the true story of Budweiser's founding. That's not the true story, which is all the more interesting because effectively what Budweiser chose to do, the brand, was really make a statement, right? And turn their origin story into an affirmation of the American dream, a country that welcomes migrants and supports their dreams. Why does this matter? Because it came literally weeks after Donald Trump created the so-called Muslim ban, where he put an automatic stop on migrants coming from 6 predominantly Muslim majority countries, right? And it came weeks after, Trump had been elected on a campaign which really had some horrible things to say about immigrants. And part of that racism was part of the, Make America Great Again pledge and promise. So effectively, what Budweiser did through this ad was make an uncompromising statement about immigrants, okay, and launch a counterclaim to the White House from America's big. Next slide, please. The other brand that I thought was doing something really interesting recently was Gillette, who ran a campaign which went straight into one of the most, biggest news stories and movements of the last few years, the Me Too movement. And what I thought was so interesting with this particular campaign was how Gillette actually owned its complicity in perpetuating a particular image of masculinity, which ultimately, led to our understanding of toxic masculinity, which obviously became, sort of involved in conversations around Me Too and what has been for many women entrenched institutionalized misogyny and sexism, and how did we get here? And Gillette came out with a campaign which actually owned its complicity and its involvement in that formation of that image. And if we can see this ad, please, and what I want you to do is please pay really careful attention to the opening, the very first little bit of this ad, because you actually see Gillette revisit some of their brand imagery from the past.
Bullying.
The Me Too movement against sexual
Toxic
harassment.
masculinity.
Is this the best a man can get? Is it? We can't hide from it.
Sexual harassment is taking over.
It's been going on far too long. We can't laugh it off.
Who's the daddy?
What I actually think she's trying to say.
Making the same old excuses.
Boys will be boys.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
Allegations regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment.
But she says
And there will be no going back. Because we believe in the best in men.
Men need to hold other men accountable.
Smile, sweetie. Come on.
To say the right thing. To act the right way.
Bro, not cool, not cool.
Some already are. In ways big
Yo, men,
and small.
I am strong.
But some is not enough.
It's not how we treat each other, okay? Okay.
Because the boys watching today will be the men of tomorrow.
Of course, online, the reaction was swift and ferocious with, so many messages to Gillette saying, oh, not all men, not all men. It would have been perhaps predictable or easy enough for Gillette to somehow, say, oh, sorry, we didn't mean to offend or whatever. Their follow-up ad actually dialed up their commitment to broadening conversations around masculinity. The follow-up ad to that one was actually the man's first shave, and it was this young man who was transgender, and he was being, watched and looked after by his father, teaching him how to shave for the first time. So effectively, what Gillette was doing was actually just going louder and bolder in trying to expand conversations around masculinity. And really what this showed is increasingly when brands commit to some kind of statement about diversity or ethics, they really have to see it through without apology or qualification. Next slide, please. So they were kind of bold, I think, examples or affirmations. Not all brands go that far that quickly. Take, for example, Vogue. So for literally centuries, Vogue has been considered, the first and last word in fashion media, but also in setting beauty standards. For some time now, we've seen lots of magazines or aspects of fashion media engaging with more diverse representations of female beauty and beauty standards. And really the last man standing, so to speak, was US Vogue. Its editor-in-chief, Anna Wintour, was actually on record as, voicing her aversion to plus size models. It seemed to be the last magazine to hold out, showcasing, a diversity of beauty standards. And by not sort of, acknowledging that conversation or those issues, it was really ignoring what for the rest of the world was glaringly obvious, which was that fashion media had for so long perpetuated inflexible, unattainable beauty standards, which contributed to the social stigma attached to fat and bigger bodies, particularly those of women, until this cover. And this cover was ostensibly a celebration of diverse female beauty. But what was really interesting was the model pictured second from the left there. Her name is Ashley Graham. She's there pictured on the right, arguably the most famous and successful plus size model in the United States. What was interesting here was this was the first time that US Vogue had pictured a larger female body on its front cover. The last one to the party, but a baby step, an important step. Next slide, please. Of course, other magazines had gone there sooner and much more emphatically. By this stage, Tess Holliday was already a massive star in fashion media and a wonderful representation of plus size beauty. So as political statements go, that was at the quieter end, right? It was a small step towards some kind of social inclusion. The complete opposite to Patagonia. Next slide, please. So Patagonia is really interesting because it was founded in 1973, but almost from its very beginning has merged the political with the brand image so completely. For those of you that don't know, Patagonia specializes in outdoor wear. So if you go hiking or kayaking or mountaineering or whatever these people do on the outside. But from its very beginning, the brand has carried activist concerns at every consumer touch point. With initiatives that address the most urgent ecological imperatives today. Next slide, please. And I'm not sure if we've got time, but next slide.
No longer can we assume the Earth's resources are limitless. We wrote this in our first catalog in 1972. Nearly 50 years later, it's only gotten worse. Today, the clothing industry contributes up to 10% of the pollution driving the climate crisis. For as long as we've been in business, we've seen quality as an environmental issue. That's why we build clothes to endure, so you don't need to buy new as often. We make gear with recycled materials. We grow food and fiber the way nature intended. We promote safe and fair labor conditions for workers. There are some things you can do too. When you want something new, ask yourself, do I really need it? Look for one product you can use in multiple ways. Repair what you wear out and pass things down. Demand recycled. Demand fair trade. Demand organic. Buy less. Demand more.
Patagonia literally tells their consumers don't buy what you don't need. So these are ads that they run on Black Friday, which is that huge crazy sale day, first day after Thanksgiving in America, where you see crowds storming Walmart, or whatever to buy discount items. And Patagonia literally says to their consumers, and this, by the way, is their best-selling jacket. They say, don't buy this jacket. If you like Patagonia, chances are you already have this jacket. And, if it's old, fix it. If it's torn, mend it, right? And so, can you aim for 3 more? I'm happy to go to the last slide, Jonathan. I'm happy to go to the last slide for the sake of, if we want to go to the last slide, and I can, yeah, that's fine. Okay. So basically what I'm saying today is that increasingly brands must do and say more. Okay. And the kinds of things that, I've spoken about today, I don't necessarily see them as just fashionable or woke or opportunistic. I think they speak directly to contemporary consumer processes, to how consumers are now empowered and armed to speak back and speak up when they don't like what they hear and say. And also how consumers are now demanding more from brands with whom we now connect with across more consumer touch points. And for me, that is where the cultural logic of branding is today. And I'll end it there. I do hope we have time for questions.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you very much indeed. I know people are really enjoying your talk, so we will go straight to questions. I'm an ex-events organizer, so I promise everyone will also finish on time. Just before I take those, can I just perhaps invite in your general comments responses? This is a thesis of cultural power from below. It seems to me, ads borrow civic capital, you said, powerful concept, representing progressive social change from below. But another key element you've highlighted is accountability enabled by technology, and in particular, social media connectivity. My question for you is, how should we read this current phase of brand activism? You've indicated it's been several decades in development, but are there indications this will be short-lived or sustained and transformative, or both?
I think it's important to think of that spectrum. And I think, and this idea of glass box branding and the extent to which consumers, and just, you know, if you care for social good, if you care for change, then you want to call this out when you see it. You know, if you think that we're being shortchanged and the brand isn't living up to its promise, you call it out. So, which is why, for example, we're increasingly seeing big brands and corporations actually publishing reports that they'll set their own KPIs for meeting certain targets and quotas, and they'll now publish them and let us know how they're tracking. So I actually, you know, the brand I'm thinking of, or the company I'm thinking of, is Microsoft, which does this really well. But I think that there's obviously a spectrum. Do I think that Vogue, you know, putting Ashley Graham on the cover is a massive step for diversity? No, it's a baby step. But in the world of fashion media, it's an important one because Vogue was the last one to do that. So I kind of feel like this is an ecosystem of sorts, and we can't expect all brands to commit, you know, or go at the same speed.
Okay, brilliant. Now, our first question is an area I know is an area of great interest and concern and activity for you. So this is from Sean Murphy. I work for UAL, our University Arts London, as a brand manager. I was wondering what your thoughts would be on the future of brand storytelling in institutions that have reached a stage where they have to hold themselves accountable for years of institutional racism. A lot of marketing seems performative to our audiences who know that our practices haven't been good enough. This isn't just for our university, but for all institutions. So how deliver a deeper accountability and community response?
Yeah, there's quite a bit to unpack there. The first thing I'll say, though, is that every institution is branded, right? So not just, you know, I've spoken about your Nikes and your Budweisers and commercial commodities, but every single organization and institution is branded and has some kind of public facing, you know, visibility, which has been crafted by professional communicators and image makers, if you like. So, you know, to the extent that, you know, we are now increasingly sensitive to their historical transgressions and perhaps contemporary transgressions as well. You know, in terms of storytelling, I think, you know, again, you know, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for these, you know, organizations or institutions to sustain a story that, you know, that is based on lies or on some kind of, you know, very selective treatment of history. I think that will be increasingly difficult for them to do. And that's as true for, you know, for churches and for banks as it is for Coca-Cola. And, you know, so the other thing I'll say is brands are always storytelling. And I just think they're telling different kinds of stories now.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So Cesar Martinez, who's from Cardiff University, says, loving the talk. I've noticed practitioners stating that brands are key for the success of social causes, but critical academics often scorn these efforts. So the divide between industry and critical response and portray brands as a neoliberal takeover. Your research seems to occupy a space in between, and you do not see brands as purely evil. Am I correct?
What I'll say is I focus on commercial brands and they're in the business of business. So, you know, if I was looking instead at public service announcements or government messaging or the work of, you know, lobbyists and advocacy groups and those that are firmly embedded in the public sphere, I would probably be doing it through a different lens and holding them kind of accountable to different criteria or measures of success and authenticity. I'm looking at commercial brands. So, you know, an organization like Nike on paper has no business talking about Black Lives Matter, right? So I think we need to, so it's not so much that I don't think that they're evil. It's not that at all. It's that I just see them, you know, I suppose selling their relevance in ways that are interesting and innovative and necessary. You know, at the end of the day, whatever messaging they make will always be tempered by their capitalist instinct for profit and for survival. I mean, I'm the first one to acknowledge that. So it's not that I don't see them as evil. It's just that, you know, their core business isn't necessarily, you know, ending racial discrimination. But here they are, you know, telling that story. So I suppose it's more a question of how I approach what they're doing.
Thank you very much. And I must say, I agree that it's about the limits on branded wisdom and commercial speech. And I've got a question from a student here at the London College of Communication. So thank you very much for that. That's from Anita, who says she's interested in particular in the glass box theory you outlined. I wonder whether there are normative ideas in place which regulates this brand transparency. How to ensure the message advertised is coherent with the brand's actions and decisions. So it's very interesting, and I'm very interested in this as well, if I can maybe tack on to the end of that. So the glass box means brands are open to challenge, but what kind of accountability is on offer? I mean, in particular, going back to the core thesis that brands are in a sense substituting for the erosion of a space of public culture and public resources. One of the key things about that environment, public resources, is that it's accountable. So what are the forms of accountability on offer with brands communication, and are they sufficient?
That's really interesting. So the term glass box branding, I borrow from, it was actually from a trend forecast company called Trend Watching, and they actually embedded it in a piece of consultation for brands and basically encouraging them to adopt, you know, assume glass box conditions. So basically, you know, for the last decade or so, brands have been told to you know, be more, you know, sync their messaging with contemporary issues and And Trend Watching, this organization, a consultancy group, basically said, hey, make sure that whatever public statements you make, whatever commitment you make, that, you know, the house is clean on the inside. You know, that if Nike is going to go out there and you know, say, yeah, Black Lives Matter, and behind closed doors is saying telling a very different story about its hiring practices, you know, that's a problem. So glass box branding is kind of speaking to the radical transparency that brands must now assume, and, you know, they'll be called out. That said, they are not our elected representatives, and they are, so, and I wouldn't for a second, you know, kind of say that we should expect of them to occupy some kind of space. If anything, it's heartbreaking that, you know, the loudest statement about Black Lives Matter for a while was coming from Nike and not from our, you know, official, you know, public institutions and organizations. I mean, that's an aberration, and that's another conversation. So, yeah, I don't know if I've answered any of those questions there, but I think there's a lot going on.
Great, thank you, Susie. I welcome more, but just while we're waiting, I know sustainability is a really key issue for you, as it is, particularly for this institution. And I wanted to ask you about what Stephen Dunn calls marketing, misleading green claims. I suppose one issue is what are the threats to the more progressive brands you're highlighting, Patagonia, from greenwashing and green claims. Yeah. And just to add some flesh, George Monbiot, in the lead up to COP26, was highlighting how the oil corporations, he said, have spent many millions of dollars on ads, memes, and films to convince us they've gone green. The latest report on this issue by the International Energy Agency reveals that in 2020, clean energy investments represented 1% of total capital expenditure. The claims don't match the delivery.
So for a long time, that space of cynicism and skepticism about any kind of claims to doing good, a lot of it rested on this idea of greenwashing and this idea that whatever commitments they're making to, a greener planet was just spin and just, talk. And I think that is a very legitimate argument. But I do want to say a few things, right, about this. All consumption entails resource use, right? All consumption. All we ever can do as consumers is make hopefully informed decisions and, kind of, I suppose, balancing options, which each one necessarily entails some kind of resource use. And I don't mean to take the heat off the brands for a second, but just to kind of underscore how complex this space is, the best kind of ethical consumer decision making tries to factor in four things, right? The sole criteria is what I'm buying: sustainable, organic, local, ethical. And I've challenged students in the past to find one commodity that would tick every single box. So for example, if I want to buy rice, do I buy, and I want to save on, carbon footprint, do I buy rice that is farmed in Queensland in Australia, doesn't have to travel too far? Well, that's good, that's local. Or do I buy fair trade rice that's being, farmed in Vietnam that will contribute to the livelihood of, impoverished workers in a developing economy? I can't have it both ways, right? I have to make some kind of decision based on whatever. And so I kind of feel like, with brands that are trying, to make some sort of green statement and are found wanting, of course they will be, because I don't think any brand, in any product category can, kind of resolve all those issues and all those questions. They all have to make decisions. And all we can do as consumers is, I think, go for that sort of arrangement which we find most ethically satisfying.
Okay, Susie, thank you very much. We've only got 2 minutes, so I'm going to put a few things to you and let you give closing remarks, essentially, as our speaker today. One, going back to Sean, we haven't touched on an area I know of deep concern and work for you, which is what's the role of universities and education in contributing to a more diverse workforce, and you're helping Australian Indigenous students and working on racial and wider ethnic diversity in the profession. So I'd like to invite you to say a little bit about that, because I'm sure the students here will welcome it. But we've also got another couple of questions. So from Gloria, my colleague and a co-author in the critical advertising series, says, you've talked about brands shift in communications away from product and towards social and cultural values. How much do you think that has to do with the rise of content marketing, branded content, as opposed to traditional advertising? Thank you, Gloria. And from Aidan Kelly, another colleague from University of East London, thank you for a really interesting talk. To what extent do you think brand activism is a new phenomena, or do you feel it's something that brands have always done historically? That's a variant on mine. So final words to you, Susie.
I think it's a question of scale. I think it's the extent to which brands increasingly, whether they like it or not, are being implicated into politically charged conversations on social media. So whichever way, if brands ignore an issue, they're called out for it. If brands, adopt an issue, they're called out for it. So I actually think that, social media, sort of bears so much responsibility for brands needing to show cultural relevance and sink in emotionally with these dominant cultural conversations. In terms of diversity in media and what we can do, again, I think it comes down to hiring practices. I'm looking at research, looking at the initiatives that agencies have adopted to actually attract, retain, and promote culturally and linguistically diverse personnel into their agencies. But what we're going to do is actually see how that meshes with what we're doing in the tertiary sector. But we're also going to go further back into the high school sector and see how this world of brand making and storytelling and image formation, how is this world as a profession, how is it told, or how is it explained to high school students? Because what we want to do is open up the space to more diverse voices, and we want all kinds of diversity. So I actually think it comes down to education, but also pipeline. So what are we doing to make this professional choice attractive to a wider range of people? I don't know if I can, we're probably out of time. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted me to.
We are just going to, someone's told me I missed a question, so at least let's articulate these. We don't really have time to answer them. My question, this is from Liana Perdiz. What narrative do you believe cosmetic brands lack in trying to connect with today's consumer ecosystem beyond just embracing diversity? Take accountability in order to create greater social brand equity and brand loyalty. Is it sustainable? So what narrative do you believe cosmetic brands lack in trying to connect to today's consumer ecosystem? In other words, is there a more tokenistic engagement with diversity without a deeper accountability?
So do we mean cosmetics as in the product cosmetics, or do we mean just superficial? I'm not sure.
Branding, product.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. I think whoever asked the question, I'd ask them to check out Fenty. Have a look at Fenty and see the market share that Fenty now enjoys. I mean, Dove did some interesting things, I think, but I mean, I'm amazed that it took a superstar and for Fenty to come along and address the glaringly obvious, which is literally this is the one space where you can make so much money from acknowledging diversity is skin tone and complexion. So I think that's actually an article I really want to write, the politics of Fenty. So.
And I think another question from Giuseppe, which again we can't take because we are going to finish, but a really important one. How can we make sustainable and ethical brands more accessible also to the poorest layer of our society? E.g., whole food is only accessible to wealthy people. So how much of this is kind of comforting assurance for rich millennials in the North rather than engaging
all right, so for the last few decades, we've known that ethical consumption, right? There's been overrepresentation of white middle class educated women. Yeah. So we know that but I mean, that is also embedded in other stories of class and privilege. So I kind of feel like that question of accessibility isn't necessarily, that's systemic and that's another conversation. That's another topic.
Well, on which note, the worst thing about an online event is you don't hear the silent applause, but I know from comments how much people have enjoyed this talk and how important the issues you've raised are. So can I thank, on behalf of everybody listening, Susie Khamis for giving up her evening out of work hours to speak to us so eloquently and wonderfully today. And perhaps to say two things just to wrap up. We are a network, so please join us and get in touch. We do have events upcoming, and if you Google the hub, you can find out details of all of them. We will be inviting Susie back. That's a promise she doesn't know about yet, to speak again soon as part of a wider agenda to look at decolonial advertising as well as all of these issues. So on that note, thank you all very much indeed, and I hope you'll join us for our next events too. And thank you, Susie, so much.
Thank you, everyone.